Hey everyone, this is Eve Picker, and if you listen to this podcast series, you're going to learn how to make some change. Thanks so much for joining us on this podcast. I'm Eve Picker, and my life revolves around cities, real estate, and crowdfunding. In this podcast series, we'll be digging deep to discover how we can build better cities by building better buildings. My guest today is friend and colleague Josh McManus. Josh describes himself as a problem solver, strategy implementer, and idea activator, and I know all three to be true. He works in post-industrial cities with entrepreneurs, corporations, and foundations to help people positively transform the places that they love. And he's obsessed with place-based change. We have that in common. Previously, Josh worked with Rock Ventures team in Detroit, helping to buy and renovate hundreds of millions of square feet of empty space in downtown Detroit. Rock Ventures serves and connects Quicken Loans founder and Cleveland Cavaliers chairman Dan Gilbert's portfolio of more than 100 companies. Nationally, Josh is a Marshall Memorial Fellow and a Next American Vanguard. Locally, he has helped found multiple organizations and has served on a variety of institutional boards in his collection of adopted hometowns, including Chattanooga, Tennessee, Detroit, Bar Harbor, and New Orleans. His thoughts have been featured by Forbes, Fast Company, The Economist, Entrepreneur, Good, USA Today, and The Huffington Post. If you want to know more about Josh after you've listened to this podcast, please visit evepicker.com, where you'll find links and other goodies on the show notes page, and where you can subscribe to my newsletter on all things real estate impact. Hi, Josh. How are you this morning?
Doing great.
Thank you so much for joining me. I know quite a lot about you, but our listeners don't. I know that you're always moving, and I'm wondering what and where you are working right now.
So I am in Dearborn, Michigan this morning. I'm fortunate to have spent a lot of time in Detroit and Dearborn over the last 10 years. My work right now is mostly to support Ford Motor Company as they transform from a past that has been just about cars to a future that's about movement and mobility overall.
That's pretty innovative stuff. So your background has been, you've been involved in a lot of real estate recently and underserved cities. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I actually realized recently that it kind of goes back to my childhood. I grew up in the shadows of a Goodyear plant in Georgia, and the life and death of that little town sort of came and went with what was going on in that factory. And so I kind of spent the entirety of my career working in post-industrial places. And one of the best tools for changing the trajectory of a place is reimagining real estate. And so I've worked in Chattanooga, Cincinnati, Akron, and then spent a lot of time in Detroit. And with each passing sort of set of interventions have sort of moved up and up in the scope of ambition of the projects that we worked on. In the last 10 years, I've been very fortunate to work on some really large-scale projects. I got to serve with the team at Rock Ventures, which has amassed over 14 million square feet of real estate in downtown Detroit, over 100 buildings, and has been party to taking most of those buildings from low or no occupancy to full or near full occupancy. And in the recent work with Ford, I was also very fortunate to be party to helping make the announcement of Ford's return into their home city of Detroit with the acquisition of Michigan Central Station, which is really turning into a living laboratory for the future of mobility. But it was this iconic abandoned structure that's now getting new life and will be online and operational in 2021, I believe.
So that's pretty big and exciting stuff. What's your background and what path led you to what you're working on now and this real estate reinvention?
I actually also had the revelation recently that I come into real estate, rightfully so. My paternal great-grandfather and paternal grandfather were in the real estate business in Georgia and had some commercial and residential transactions and holdings. And then I sort of spent this blended upbringing where my dad was a CEO, my mom's an artist, and I was sort of torn between those two polarities of doing beautiful and good things for the world and doing business things. I went on to get business degrees, both undergraduate and graduate, but most of my work focused on how to leave places better than you found them. And I eventually sort of came up with this reconciliation. I call it for purpose. So instead of for profit, for purpose, which is attempting to work at the intersections of moral imperative and market imperative. And all of my work in real estate is very much in that direction, which is how do you make places both humane and maximization machines for human potential, but how do you also make them fiscally feasible so that you can do the projects again and again and at scale? And it's a fine line to walk, but it's really where my interests are, is how do we build for-purpose places that serve people well, serve communities well, and serve capital interests to the extent that they have to.
Yes, I love the idea of leaving places better than you found them. And it sounds easy, but it's probably the most difficult thing about it is that people have different ideas about what better is, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. Real estate redevelopment is a very loaded subject right now.
It certainly is.
National conversations on things like gentrification, which are understandable, while at the same time, there's national and global conversations about economic stagnation. And so people are very clear on things they don't like when people get pushed out or when people, can't stay in a place or can't thrive in a place. That in between space of how do you make places work for everybody is oft talked about, but very little delivered. And I think that's why I've had such a consistent interest in it, is how do we build places that maximize the potential for all, that are able to retain talent that already exists there, but to attract new talent at the same time. I feel like it's one of the few things that could be a lifelong pursuit because it's complex enough, it's going to evolve enough. As I know you feel the same way. I mean, it's the problem that I'll never solve, but I think I'll always love working on it.
Be sure to go to evepicker.com and sign up for my free educational newsletter about impact real estate investing. You'll be among the first to hear about new projects you can invest in. That's evepicker.com. Thanks so much. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And actually, the interesting thing about interviewing people I've interviewed so far, they're all tackling the problem from a different angle. It's absolutely fascinating. And their backgrounds have led them to a different place where they have different skills and they may be able to help in a different way. I don't know how you get them all together. It's very difficult. And it is, as you said, very loaded. Developers are not very popular at the moment, although they may be the answer in some ways, somehow.
Yeah, actually, I think there's an emergent field. This has been one of the hard things for me. And going back to, I think you and I met probably a dozen years ago.
Yeah, it was a long time.
And we met. We met in sort of this island of misfit toys fashion, the old gatherings of CEOs for cities. But what was fascinating about that is that I was an early social entrepreneur. You were doing both that sort of place-based change and development work. And then there was a mix of other people that really shouldn't have intersected with each other. And what I've felt since then is there is this emergent field. Like I guess my resume would say that I've been proxy to a lot of development. I by no means would consider myself a developer, and I don't know that I ever will. But it feels like to me that there's an emergent field that is something slightly different from developer that needs a name. It doesn't have that name yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. Something to ponder. So then what is real estate impact investing from your perspective?
So overall, I think that we are on the precipice of democratization of finance in a way that we've certainly not seen in our lifetimes. And I mean, it may have happened in certain ways in the past where you opened up finance to more people, but the impact falls in this overarching democratization of finance wave that is impending. And what I mean by that is, I've always, some of the economics theory stuff that I've read, there's this notion of perfect capitalism. A lot of people right now are talking about post-capitalism. I'm still talking about perfect capitalism. And it would be where supply and demand met each other in real time and worked its way towards efficiencies. And so impact real estate investing to me is just the opening of the capital markets for good projects to meet good capital at a cost that's sustainable. And this is being equipped and enabled by technology, by new modes of thinking, and by measurements that are no longer single bottom line, which I think is totally appropriate. The sort of arms race we've had towards single bottom line returns since Milton Friedman economics set in is very problematic. And this return to impact, to me, feels like a return to understanding, our core biological instincts, which are self-preservation. So impact finance to me feels like return to what's right and the pursuit of more perfect capitalism.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, but I have to wonder whether it's really working that way yet. At the moment, I feel that impact investors are seeking the good as well as the return. And we know what it looks like to put together an impactful project in a soft market, and the returns are never going to be that great. And if you offer bigger returns to investors, that works its way down to the occupant of the building who might be an affordable housing tenant. So I don't know, do you agree that somehow, this great divide between the haves and have-nots is not just about the money they have, but also the expectations for the money they have? I'm not sure I'm describing
that. No, I follow. And I think there's a couple of forces in play. One is, just as we saw a wave of greenwashing over the last 10, 15 years, where now everything is organic and you can't tell whether organic is good or not. We're in a great period of good watching right now. And so it seems that every way I turn right now, everybody's an impact investor because that is fashionable. But then if you look at the core of some of these folks' beliefs and return expectations, they truly are willing to receive returns that are multiple bottom lines. And then there are some people who have just good watched and expect the same, arbitrary financial returns that they saw under other boom times that have advantaged capital over everything else. So I think that's an issue. I also think that we are, like say, on the precipice, but not there yet with truly unlocking all capital with all risk orientations. I mean, the work that you've been doing on Reg CF with small change is absolutely fascinating to me, because bringing folks who are holding capital that they've only been able to see, microscopic returns on for any sort of lower risk opportunities, people that have only been able to see a money market account or CDs, like these things that have been low single digit returns. So allowing those folks to bring capital on the table, and then all of a sudden, 6% returns to them looks really good compared to what they've seen in the past. And I just think we've still got a lot of capital that's yet to be unlocked that has different return perspectives on it. And so I think we got to be patient in getting all capital onto the playing field, and then getting it liquid enough that it can move in the directions of projects where those folks are going to see a proper risk-adjusted return. I think in you guys' shoes over in what you're doing with small change. What's got to be tough is it's a little bit Wild West right now. And so you can't tell, it's hard to tell the difference between who's good and who's good watching. And it may take a period of time before that sorts itself out.
No, I think it is going to take some time for sure. How much, I'm not sure. But
yeah.
we'll try to be patient. Yeah. So, when you look at cities, that you travel a lot, you go to a lot of cities. Do you think socially responsible real estate is necessary in today's development landscape?
Yeah, I think socially responsible everything is necessary in every landscape.
That was a loaded question.
Throughout time. I mean, I'm an avid consumer of a lot of historical information, and the times when we put ourselves in great peril is when we are socially irresponsible. My dad, the CEO, raised me as a capitalist with one caveat. Like every time he would remind me that I was a capitalist, he would also remind me that unbridled greed is the Achilles heel of capitalism. And so unbridled greed is not socially responsible. It's also not sustainable. I mean, we have to have a system that can allow returns on capital, but can allow returns on, I call them the other ROIs, like the returns on individuals. So can individuals maximize their potential? So in addition to return on investment, return on individuals, and then also our ROIs in like return on ideas. Like, are we rewarding and testing new ideas? And this is especially problematic in the real estate business because things all too often get too formulaic, too templatized. You and I share a friend in Jonathan Tate who's looked at the structure and form of multifamily housing units. And I mean, there's a big problem there in that it becomes templatized. The capital gets comfortable with that template, but then that template stops serving people in the way that needs to be. So I spend a lot of time out in the.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, I think is the crux of it all. We need innovation in cities and innovation in placemaking, and our financial institutions are not built to be innovators. And they have a formula for looking at real estate development that perpetuates the same, just, in the way you said. It's a very difficult cycle to break out of. And yet I see so many creative developers coming to me with the most amazing ideas, like how can we unleash them all and finance them all? I think we would have better cities, right?
Yeah, the marketplace has to be there. And then we've got to get, in all of this post-industrial city work I've done, I've worked a lot with large and small foundations, some national, some place-based. Foundation capital is interesting to me because I think it can and should be the most risk-oriented capital in the whole world. So an evergreen foundation that throws off 5% of its corpus every year and at annualized return rates that are adjusted over time, that means that corpus is evergreen. We allow that in the tax code because we see a benefit, that there should be a benefit to humanity and to society. That most risk-oriented money should be going into a lot of these real estate projects, especially for model testing purposes. And that's not totally the case right now. We've started to see some of that happen with some foundations, but there's a weird thing that happened where foundations would get hit up for a lot of capital campaigns. And so then they categorically said, we're not going to be in the real estate business anymore. And I completely understand, not building another wing onto a museum or building another dorm room at a college or university. But we need to go back and revisit that amongst the philanthropy crowd to say, we probably shouldn't be in the rote real estate business, but we should be in the real estate innovation business. And the foundation capital, being the most risk-oriented, should be the ones that are trying the highest likelihood of transformation efforts on affordable housing. I mean, it was interesting to me to see the announcement, I don't know if you saw it or not, from Google last week, say they're going to put $1 billion into affordable housing in the Bay Area. There's a crazy statistic out there. I think it's in the last 10 years, for every 12 new jobs that have been created, only 1 unit of housing has been created.
Wow.
At the same time. So you have these incredible pressures. And so you see Google putting $1 billion into that, and that's a survival metric for them. They're not going to be able to retain and attract talent if people can't afford to live.
Right.
But I think that philanthropic money should be thinking the same way. If you've got a broken real estate market in a community, you may be the intervention of last resort, and you've got to fix that positively or negatively. I'll just give you one example of how we thought about that. So the work that I did with Rock Ventures is now carried on by a team that's led by a lady named Laura Graneman. They have gone very, very deep in working to figure out how to stop the blight machine that exists in the Detroit city limits. And that has required not just investments in blight reduction, but significant investment in education of homeowners so that the foreclosure process is slowed and eventually stopped. It's required investments in rehabbing some houses for stabilization purposes, full neighborhood size interventions. But I think that's a good example of the level that philanthropy will have to intervene at to get markets back to operational. And then once that happens, maybe they can move on, or maybe they can move to commercial. But we need risk-oriented money in the mix for sure.
Yeah, and actually, foundations can invest in lots of other ways that aren't necessarily bricks and mortar, but end up being placemaking. There are many zoning codes that need to be looked at, for an example, and change to permit density in a way that they're not written. One example that I've watched with interest is in the city of Melbourne in Australia, where maybe it might be as long as 10 years ago now, but a few years back, they introduced density zoning overlay along all the major corridors in the city. And it's been because those are transit corridors, and they were trying to really implement density without the need for adding more cars. And it's been really interesting watching that emerge. It's an interesting thesis that's a little tinker with a zoning code to really make development happen in a different way. I'm fascinated by that. Or in Pittsburgh, I had a little nonprofit and built a tiny house, which in itself was plenty of work and interesting. But the most interesting outcome to me was that several years later, just last year, the city of Pittsburgh actually created an overlay district for that little underserved neighborhood so that they could build an experiment with ADUs and tiny houses, which are really not part of the zoning code. And to me, that was like an absolutely wonderful outcome of this little $200,000 project. So there's ways to experiment and innovate, I think, that go beyond just building something.
No, you're bringing attention to something. One of the things that I've wanted to see created or to help create that I haven't had time is what I sort of describe as this Center for Municipal Policy Innovation.
Oh, and fabulous.
It's under the realization that it's funny because I watched a little bit of the Democratic debates last night just to kind of see what's going on in that world. But yes. I had the realization, like studying American history, there was a time when federal policy was the be-all, end-all for impacting local life in America. When we were debating major social, major fiscal policies, then federal policy was where it's at. The debates that we have on federal policies right now do have local impact, but they don't have the local impact that they did, all the way through the 1800s. At some point, the game really moved to the states, and state policy started to have a large impact, on whether if you have state income tax or not, or how you fund education, how you think about crime. So during that period, governors were sort of where it was at for impacting day-to-day life at the neighborhood level. Today, it's really down to a place where I think your mayor matters a lot more than your president. And that throws a lot of people off because of the drama that's happening on our national policy stage right now. But the truth is, I travel so much, and the quality of life at a neighborhood level is much more greatly impacted by the policy choices of a city's mayor than by the president nor Congress. Now, if you follow Twitter all the time and watch TV all the time, you might think otherwise. But the actuality of it, of what your access to transportation is, what your access to parks and public places are, what the quality of your local education offerings are, the folks that have their hands in that are local politicians, much, much, much more so than national or state politicians. And so I think, this game of sitting around saying, well, when is the state or the Fed's going to help us fix this stuff is completely wrongheaded, and that the game is really transforming at a local level. And a lot of cities, my time in Detroit, I think my biggest fear for Detroit right now is that they went unregulated during the bankruptcy period. Like there was very low regulation on a lot of development activities and other things. Mm-hmm. And now they're turning back on a development regime that's really dated circa 1950. And I think, there's folks that are working hard to try to update some of that. But these communities that have these sort of leftover enforcement regimes that are from times that are no longer here and didn't really deliver results that were optimal for all people, this is highly problematic. We need to be scrubbing local zoning issues. I mean, the way that you're zoned from a density standpoint has a very fast waterfall effect to what's going to happen with education and transportation. And I think a lot of citizens don't realize that, and they fall into a default sort of NIMBY setting, which is ill-advised because it means that you make decisions that don't impact, your kids, your surrounding neighborhood, your surrounding businesses.
Right. Well, if you start your school, count me in, because I think it's really important. I'm always astonished at, how much power politicians have and how little they know about urban design, planning, architecture, and the impact that it can have on place. So I think that's really important. So do you think there are any current trends in real estate development that are really important for the future of our cities?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think my observation is that we're seeing the radical transformation of the three primary forms of real estate right before our very eyes. And these are things that have, at least in the U.S., have held true almost since our foundation. And so I'll unpack that a little bit. On commercial real estate, we've existed off of a owner-broker model that was predicated on square feet and years. So if I wanted to lease office space for my commercial offices, then I went and met with a broker who represented a property owner, and we had a debate and discussion about how many years and how many square feet I needed for my offices. And due to the demands of the property owner and also to the inertia of the whole situation, we typically had a very long-term discussion. So the property owner and the broker really wanted to get me into 5 years, and they wanted to get me into as much square footage as possible at as high a leasehold rate as they could get their hands on.
Both for different reasons, right? One, because the broker is incentivized to do the biggest deal possible because the way the broker gets paid is on a percentage commission basis, right?
Yeah.
Which is also a really broken piece of this all. Yeah.
Yeah. So then what I see happening right now, again, with technology, democratization, and ability to understand real-time supply and demand, is almost this continuously variable financing of real estate. And you see it manifest the best in things like WeWork, because whereas the CBREs of the world are still out there going, well, how many square feet and how many years do you want this for? WeWork is saying, well, how many desks do you want and how many days do you want them for? And that's a transformation of the pro forma, because at CB Richard Ellis, they wanted me to rent that space, and they wanted me to put one person per every 300 square feet or 350 square feet, like as much as room as they would, as I would sign up for. That's what they wanted to get me to. By changing the pro forma around and by aligning the interest of the broker owner, and now that's kind of collapsing into the same thing sometimes. WeWork says desk and days, and what they don't talk about as much is, square feet, because now if you go into a WeWork office, there's one desk per every 75 square feet. Right. What's fascinating about that is that it's a healthier performing pro forma. It's also more environmentally sustainable because you're conditioning less space. It has a higher energy level to it. And so people who work in those spaces feel a different level of energy. You can also shift the pro forma to have more amenities because you're spending less money on just bare space and conditioning of that bare space.
And it really supports startup and small businesses who can't really find the time to put all the necessary utilities and amenities together for themselves. So there's like an added bonus, right?
It also allows them, this continuously variable is priced based upon risk. And so I may price your desk rate higher if you're a more risky client, or if you want more flexibility. Essentially what you're paying for is optionality. But it also allows you, if you're a startup, to be like, well, this month I have 12 employees and next month I have 17. Oh, then we went through a down cycle and I'm at 11. And it's more, pay to play than this encumbrance that so many companies have been so scared of, which is this 5-year lease with these ridiculous guarantees and prepayments. And so I think it actually accelerates the economy because it gives people more options to play the way they want to, when they want to. It's still fine for the landlord and the broker because they're pricing risk into it. So their margin is still there.
Early on in my real estate career, I was known as the only developer in Pittsburgh who would actually lease out space for a year at a time. And I built, have some buildings that have smaller office spaces. And I would find these startup tenants and I would take a risk and they'd stay for a year and then they'd stay for another. And some of them ended up staying for 20. Maybe because I understood who they were, because I was like that myself. But I couldn't find anyone to help me find tenants because it wasn't worth their while. So I love that the internet is sort of producing new models and helping make that happen. Yeah. Anyway, sorry to disrupt.
So that's commercial. And then what you've got happening on retail.
Oh, that's huge.
Is similar. Retail both in the displacement of some retail to online, but the retail that's persisting is highly exponential. I think that you're seeing a lot more revenue share rents at the ground level. So it's aligning the interest of the landlord and the lessee. And you're also seeing a lot of things like food halls. And the way those are working out is the landlord, the broker, and the lessee are sharing costs differently. So if I'm at a food hall, the property owner or the property manager may be the one who's buying some of that back of house equipment and carrying the debt or the cost of that equipment. But what that does is create lower barrier to entry for more localized, more authentic offerings to go into place. And then when those offerings perform very well, both the landlord and the lessee are sharing in those outcomes.
Yeah,
and so that's
co-working for food, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And then the final transformation that I'm watching in real estate is the residential side of it. And if you look backwards, if I need to stay a night, I'm in a Marriott right now. So if I need to stay a night, I would go to a hotel. If I need to stay for a week, I stayed for an extended stay. If I need to stay for 3 months, then I would go to some corporate housing that had furniture in it. And if I needed to stay for longer than that, I could stay for 12 months or 24 months. But it had to be a fixed increment. And now that's all sort of collapsing. So I moved my family down to New Orleans over the winter. And we actually went on Airbnb and, did a long-term rental on Airbnb, longer-term rental, so it's more like a 90 days. And the algorithm there sort of brokered some adjustments to say, hey, you're staying for a longer time. That's good for you. That's good for the landlord. Like, let's get the economics of this right. And it foreshadows for me that you're going to have this optionality in the future on a small number of platforms to, like, whether I need to stay one night or 1 week or 6 months,
Yeah.
that I'll be able to do that. And the data will help you understand what the right pricing is for both parties. And so it's democratizing that and de-risking it. So I'm extremely excited because I think what you're seeing is this melt into something where supply and demand can meet each other in much greater fashion, faster fashion, with more transparency and more benefit in both directions.
So, but that plays into financing these things, which are all new and innovative, and financial institutions often don't understand. I mean, I have a building that is now a co-working building, and I moved from traditional office spaces to getting rent as the building owner from desks. And I have an operator who manages the building much like a hotel operator. And, I've been paying my mortgage on time on that building for at least 13 years, never missing a payment, and went to them for a credit line to make some improvements and couldn't get it financed because they just didn't understand where the income was coming from. So we're back to the first issue we talked about, which is the financial institutions really, for whatever reason, it may not be their fault. They have all their regulations to deal with, but they're squashing the innovation out of cities. And these innovations are happening regardless. And there's going to have to be different financing tools. I hope a banker is listening here.
I couldn't agree more, but I think that, wishing for bankers to figure it out, I think bankers always follow the lowest common denominator de-risk path. I did have, some insight in working for Rock Ventures. That's the sort of holding company that sits next to Quicken Loans, and Quicken Loans in some ways is in that traditional banking category, but in most ways is not. What I learned in that world is that a lot of people look at that as fintech rather than finance.
That's
and
true.
So I think
it's true. Yeah.
I think that there is a major opportunity, and the way that this is likely going to get handled at scale is you're going to see the development of a capital class that's called re-fintech, so real estate fintech. And I think that's the exact money that is financing things like WeWork right now. If you look at that, WeWork, it's not your traditional, it's more your soft banks. It's your folks that understand that data has value, that technology has inherent value, but that you also need to finance, large amounts of physical property. So it's a blended, it's not just tech, it's physical property and tech living together side by side. So I think this is going to come off of a completely new capital class. And that as you start to see exits, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the IPO of WeWork. If that goes well, that probably forms the foundation of this re-fintech, capital class that will subvert the banks. And then I think once it subverts the banks, then the banks will try to figure out how to get in that game.
Yeah, I think that's right. And okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit because we've been talking a long time, but I want to know the answer to this. So you started I don't know if it was the beginning, but when I first met you, you were doing quite a lot of community engagement work. And I'm wondering what community engagement tools that you've seen or used that you really believe work.
Probably around the time that we met was the time that I got involved in conceiving and driving what we thought and what we still think is the world's largest community visioning process. So we got over 26,000 people to participate in ideas for the future of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And that was fascinating for me because all the assumptions were totally wrong. We thought it would happen mostly online. It happened 80% on paper. We thought that folks would, be sort of single issue voters, and they turned out to be very dynamic in what their interests were in the community. We thought that when you were faced with the issue of vision, that people would have really, really wild ideas, and really en masse, the community has sort of incremental ideas. So if you're looking for breakthrough ideas, I learned that sort of big survey processes were not the way to go for it. After all this time of doing it, and I did that, and then I've done a lot of other approaches, I believe in what I call humanity-centered design. And I've got a process that I've developed for it. But what it what it says is, don't build nor design things for what you believe is a community. Build and design things for what you know is a community. So any intervention you build should be with the deep observation of the issues that you're trying to understand and intervene on. And what I mean by that is, like, if you want to intervene on affordable housing and you don't have a lot of people involved who have lived in, are living in, and are currently pursuing affordable housing, then it's going to be really hard to get it right. And so, just as human-centered design has put people in hospital beds when you're trying to innovate in hospitals, this humanity-centered design says, well, I got to take it more than, just innovation on behalf of the patient. I've got to find innovation on behalf of the entire patient base. So I believe in this humanity-centered design. I believe in feedback from the people, and I believe in that in two different ways. I think if you need to understand what consensus is, then you mass survey and representative sample. I think if you need to look for innovation, you actually have to do constrained dreaming. And what I mean by that is, we did the world's largest community visioning process, and people wanted a little cleaner, a little, less traffic, a little better amenities. But then we did this other process that was called city R&D, where we said, okay, we've got downtown, we've got the mall area, and we've got the new giant auto factory, and we need to connect these three together. And what are your wildest ideas for connecting these things together? And when you constrained the problem like that, the imagination became really much more bold. So people had public art ribbons and rubber tired trolleys and all of these different ways that you could connect these assets together that they didn't come up with when they were just asked to imagine a better community and describe it. So I think that community process has to be selective around, are you trying to figure out what consensus is? Or are you trying to figure out what innovation is? And then the last thing I want to mention is my friend Mark Wallace, who runs the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy. I feel like he really stumbled into, or intentionally drove into, new territory from a community input standpoint with the new park that they've just announced on the Detroit Riverfront. And what he did was actually go get a representative sampling. So I think it was 21 folks, like real people from neighborhoods, mom and her kids, a set of retirees. And these are people that were not your usual suspects in public participation. Mm-hmm. And then what he did is put them on a plane, and they went to the best parks in the country.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, they experienced those parks, and then they came back and worked with the designers to say what they wanted in their park. And so instead of,
that's really cool,
doing surveying, like, he found his representative sampling of the community, made sure that they were unbiased because they weren't usual suspects and participants, like people that are in the know, used their input to come up with a plan that I'm super, super excited about. So I think that may be a next practice too.
That's pretty cool. So I'm going to have to interview Mark.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's great.
Okay. And so, one last question. Where do you think the future of real estate impact investing lies, in summary?
In summary, I think that all of us that care about real estate impact investing have to continue to drive for policies, tools, and patrons, for that matter, who are committed to the democratization of finance. When the controls are in the hands of the commons instead of in the hands of a small few who may make choices that were based on that sort of unbridled greed that is this Achilles heel of capitalism, that is problematic. So anything that we can build, that we can do, that we can advocate for, that allows finance to further democratize, to allow all people to participate in it and to participate in ways that are fair and just, I think that's what the future looks like.
Okay, that's great. So I do have 3 sign-off questions that I'm asking everyone, because I'd like to sort of tabulate the answers in the end. And so, the first question is, what's the key factor that makes a real estate project impactful to you?
Well, I'll tell you a quick story about, like, there was a time when everybody was talking about Denver, and they're like, Denver's changing. Denver's changing. You got to go see Denver. Denver's changing. And then you went to Denver, and it was like 3 blocks. And so,
Yes, I remember that.
So, yeah. And I mean,
you could
me,
say the same about Corktown. You know that, right?
Yeah, totally. Actually,
like, where is Corktown? It's this block. Yeah.
Yeah. That's my friends, the Coolies, and they started with the barbecue shop.
Yes.
But that does get to how I measure these things, is like a project that is so impactful that people start to talk about, a place because that one project. It's happened with a place called the Flying Squirrel in Chattanooga. Incredibly designed, really smart bar that really accelerated the south side of the city. So that's what I'm looking for in transformative real estate, is does the project have the ability to play above its fighting weight because it becomes contagious? And so does it cause adjacent development? Does it get written up because it has particular aspects of it? So like Jonathan Tate's odd lot work that he's done down in New Orleans, does it set precedent? Does it challenge people? Does it change the status quo? And do you come back to it in 10, 15, 20 years and all sorts of other stuff has happened around it because it was that compelling unto itself?
Yes. Okay. And then other than by raising money, how do you think involving investors through crowdfunding could benefit the impact real estate developer?
Well, when I speak of the democratization of finance, the disassociation of capital and community that happened since the 1950s is very problematic. And so what has the potential to happen now? So I'm working through, before we got on the line, I was working through a small investment in a place-based development out of my IRA, so a self-directed IRA investment that's in my neighborhood in New Orleans. And what that does is reconnect me, my capital, and my community together. And so I think that's what's to come for the investor, is to no longer be a spreadsheet jockey who is just sitting there looking for returns, but to actually participate in the true act of community by the utilization of your capital to deliver things that include returns for you, but include a lot more than that.
Right. Okay. And then if you could think of one thing that would improve real estate development in the US, what would it be?
I think one thing that would improve real estate development in the US would be a rapid evolution of understanding of zoning, because I feel like just as the municipal boundaries of most communities were formed at a time of horse and carriage, most of our zoning requirements still date back to times when heavy industry and light industry were really different from each other. And heavy industry had machines that could suck people into them and cause major problems and had major health concerns. I look at additive manufacturing, experiential retail, multifamily, affordable residential, and I know in the future we're going to have all of those on the same block with each other. And so accelerating to standards that allow for that to happen seems really important to me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Josh, it's been really lovely talking to you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I can't wait to hear about what you're next working on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation, Eve.
That was Josh McManus. I hope you enjoyed listening to him as much as I enjoyed talking to him. Josh gave me 3 great takeaways. First, he believes we are on the precipice of the democratization of finance. Second, all segments of the real estate market are innovating and transforming rapidly right before our eyes. And third, just as we lived through a wave of greenwashing, we are now in a wave of good washing. We need to be patient for investors to catch up. What did you learn? You can read more about Josh on the show notes page for this podcast at evepicker.com. While you're there, please consider signing up for my newsletter to find out more about how to make money in real estate while making some change. Thank you so much for spending your time with Josh and I today. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.